Hey everybody, I just finished my copy of Beyond the Salvation Wars by Matthew Bates. This was published by Brazos just last month as I record this, and I want to say thank you to Brazos for giving me a review copy. This is my honest take on this book. I'll step through just a little bit about the author and my experience with Bates as a writer. Try to summarize the main idea of this book, which that's going to be a challenge to do, but I'm going to try to do that succinctly. Then I'll comment on the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then finally my reactions at the very end. So if you want to just jump to my final thoughts, kind of my reactions to this book as a whole, just skip ahead to that part. But I'll step through the other things just to give you a bigger sense of what this book is, where it comes from, kind of contextualize it and situate it a little bit. So let's jump in. First of all, Matthew Bates is someone that I've been a fan of for a while. I can't remember exactly when it was. It was at least 6-7 years ago. I read Salvation by Allegiance Alone. You might, if you're a sharp-eyed viewer, it's up behind the graphic of the book here. I have a couple of his books on this shelf. Salvation by Allegiance Alone is a fantastic book. Still maybe my favorite book by him that I've read. I've read a handful. I also love The Birth of the Trinity. But I've liked his work quite a bit. He is a biblical studies person, particularly focused on New Testament studies. He is a New Testament professor currently at Northern Seminary, but he has a long academic career working actually in Catholic academic settings. So he is a Protestant confessionally, but has worked deeply in Catholic academic settings and knows Catholic theology really well. And he also comes from, I don't know that if he would accept the label New Perspective, and I actually don't think that's a great label for him anyways, but he fits maybe a little more closely to New Perspective on Paul type work than the Old Perspective, though he critiques the New Perspective as well. But he especially is kind of in this camp of reclaiming the allegiant loyalty language around pistis or faith, than an old perspective quote unquote Protestant position is. So especially with his work on Paul and faith language, that's kind of where he's coming from. But he's just a careful scholar. He's done really good work in a lot of areas. I also love OnScript, which is a podcast he's involved with. So this book is coming from him and building on a lot of his previous work. If you've read Gospel Allegiance, Saved by Allegiance Alone, you'll know kind of where he's going in some respects with this. But let's jump into the main idea then of this book. So this book has really has stirred up some response in certain quarters, and I'll comment on that in my reactions at the very end a little bit. But that's because I'm not surprised at the controversy around this book, because it's a very bold book. It's bold and ambitious in the number of things it's taking on. So that's going to make this main idea a little bit tricky to wrestle down, but I'll do my best here. So what Bates is doing with this book is trying to clearly articulate very specific soteriological doctrines according to both Protestant and Catholic traditions, and he's trying to elucidate the differences between those doctrines. When I say soteriological doctrines, I'm talking about doctrines of salvation. So like, how does salvation work? The mechanics of salvation and grace and transformation in people's lives. Like, how does it really work? Like, how does the gospel actually like change people's lives and produce salvific kind of effects? And what's the role of grace and what's the role of faith and the human response? And all of these things are bound up. Sanctification is another term. We'll get justification. These are all bound up in kind of the process of being saved, which is broadly soteriological issues. So he is diving really deep into soteriology as it's kind of most popularly understood in both Protestant, especially Protestant evangelical, Calvinistic, Reformed kind of camp, and Catholic soteriology. And he is trying to, in my mind, what this book is trying to do is to speak with a lot of clarity and precision on how these two camps articulate soteriology and concepts underneath that, like I just went through. But also he's trying to disambiguate the gospel proper and the effects or the outflow of the gospel in people's lives. So he's trying to separate those things out and then also speak about the doctrines that have been kind of built up in Catholic and Protestant thinking, and especially in a mainstream popular sense, and a large piece of his argument is that if we first distinguish what the gospel is with a lot of clarity and precision, and especially in a biblical studies sense, like what does the New Testament very clearly say the gospel is, and therefore what is it not, his argument is that once you get to clarity on that, a lot of soteriological doctrines are actually not the gospel proper, and that puts them in this place where they can actually be re-examined and thought through, and potentially revisited, potentially adjusted. Potentially we can look at some of the words we're using and what we mean by certain words, and maybe we're actually not as far off as we thought we were, for example. So he's really issuing a clarion call to get clear on what the gospel is and is not, and then correctly position the doctrines that are not the gospel as doctrines that can be discussed and thought through. And there's a strong ecumenical unity push in this book to say, like, maybe there are ways that we can come together in these broad traditions that have been so intractably separated for hundreds of years now. Maybe there was ways we can come together that we haven't been willing to do yet, because we haven't been willing to discuss doctrines, because we haven't had clarity on what the gospel actually is and is not. So he would argue, just to get into a little bit of some specifics, he would argue that justification is not located in the gospel itself, because the gospel is a proclamation of events that testify to Christ being king. So to proclaim Christ as king is to proclaim his life, his death, his resurrection, his ascension especially, and to proclaim the events of those things and the status of Christ therefore being king is not actually saying anything about the justification of a person, right? The justification of a person has to do with their response to that proclamation. And how that works out, that's where you get into soteriology. So he's really pressing hard to try to get clarity around what the gospel is as proclamation and the doctrines that flow out of that proclamation, and then arguing for or contending for kind of a coming to the table and discussing those things so that Christians can be more unified across these differences that have existed for a really long time. There's also a historical theology, kind of philosophy of history plank to his argument that I think is really interesting, where he contends that it's possible to make these adjustments because we've done that over the course of Christian history, because we've discovered things over the course of Christian history that shed light on our understandings. So he points to things like the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the documents like the Didache, which wasn't discovered till the 1800s, or certain translations of really early writings from people like Justin Martyr that testify to very early practices in the life of the church that weren't discovered until within the past 150 years or so. And that when we discover these things, they rightly shed some light, give some illumination to ideas that we've held about, especially ideas we've held about the early church in the early centuries, and that should rightly have some bearing on some of the outworking of some of these ideas. Now, importantly, those developments don't change the gospel proper if you, again, have clarity and precision on what the gospel is, because the gospel as event, and I think he's really right here. This is my favorite aspect of his work. The gospel is an event and a proclamation of events that are testified to in the New Testament, and that's really never going to change. It's our doctrines and our understandings of the effect of those events or the response to those events that can be changeable and can be negotiable. So when he titles the book Beyond the Salvation Wars, he's trying to get past these intractable debates. That one of the reasons they are intractable in his view is that Protestants especially will improperly locate a doctrine like justification by faith and say it is the gospel, when in reality, his argument is that it's not the gospel. It's an important outworking of the gospel. And so he's trying to dismantle some of these polemics and rhetorical strategies and really division that have existed for a really long time. Now, a little bit more on the main idea. I'm going to try to move off this. There's a lot going on in this book, so I knew this was going to be hard to summarize, but the other thing I want to say about this is that he moves through a surprisingly large list of topics. So, nailing down the gospel, he makes a biblical studies case for what the gospel is and why he thinks it is that. And then he also talks about things like baptism. There's a chapter on doctrines around baptism. There's a chapter on the doctrine of once saved, always saved. There are chapters that really carefully walk through things like Catholic sacramentology and Protestant understandings of justification by faith. And he goes to, this is another thing I really liked about the book, is he goes to really great pains to describe soteriological doctrines from one camp to another. So a Protestant reading this book gains a lot of really helpful and clear definitions of Catholic sacramentology as it relates to, especially as it relates to how Catholics understand the impartation or infusion of grace into a person's life. It's really, really helpful stuff. But he's describing these things so that someone with a different view can understand them with more clarity. But yeah, he talks about baptism. He talks about the Ordo Salutis. There's a chapter on that's really interrogating the Protestant understanding of the Ordo Salutis, and these kind of, especially the distinction that Protestants draw between justification and sanctification. There's a lot of discussion of justification by faith, and there's a discussion in a chapter on the once saved, always saved doctrine, especially in more Calvinistic Protestantism. And that's not even everything. I mean, there's a lot of topics, and if you're a reader, you'll know that all those things I just listed, many of those topics have plenty of single book length treatments on just those topics alone. And yet they're all bundled in this one book. And I'll comment more about that in my reaction, but it's possible there's a little bit too much going on here, is one reaction that I do have to it. But that's what it is. So Beyond the Salvation Wars is a wide, sweeping, and bold argument that we got to get clear on what the gospel is and what it is not. And once we get there, we can then get some clarity on these other secondary doctrines that flow out of the gospel. And then once we do that, maybe we can approach some like broad-minded discussions about what church unity could look like, and coming back around the table and maybe finding that there's some commonality here that we can all center ourselves around. Because, importantly, he asserts multiple times in this book that Catholics and Protestants both have the gospel when you rightly understand the gospel as he understands it, which is a proclamation of the kingliness of Jesus through events attested to in the New Testament, that everyone has the true gospel. And that's a super important thesis that I think is getting missed in a lot of the controversy around this book. So yeah, that's my attempt to summarize the main idea. A lot going on. But let's try to more quickly move through some of these next topics here before this gets way too unwieldy and too long. So the research of this book, it wouldn't be fair to just simplistically categorize this as only a biblical studies book, but the center of gravity of the argument is more biblical studies than it is theology. If you're familiar with the long-running, sometimes contrived but sometimes legitimate conflict that is between so-called theology and biblical studies academics, this is more of a biblical studies work. He is centering, front-loading exegetical arguments. There's discussion of especially Greek language and cultural context of passages. There's a lot of argumentation that results in essentially concluding, I'm arguing this because this is what Scripture argues. So it's a biblical studies front and center book, I would say, although it does get into theology because it has to, because of the topics that he's discussing when he talks about sacramentology or baptism or justification or all these things. So it's not too neat and tidy, just biblical studies, but it's primarily biblical studies. And I say that to say, if you're a biblical studies person, you'll love that. If you're a theology person, you might find it annoying or frustrating. I don't know. But that's what it is. The research, though, is very good. And from an exegetical perspective, it's really strong. It's really compelling stuff. I think one example is his work on disambiguating the plural emphasis on doctrines like baptism and justification and election. Oh, there's a whole section, I forgot to mention this in the main idea, there's a whole discussion of election and predestination and foreknowledge. But when he gets into the exegesis of those concepts, particularly in the epistles and Paul's writing in the New Testament and such, he drills really into careful discussion of the plural nature of the language and the individualistic focus of our culture and how that gets us into trouble when we think about what it means, what election means, and what God's purposes as an election are when it's communal versus our individualistic application of it. So that's one example of the exegetical work. Of course, he gets into exegesis around the word pistis as allegiance and all of that too. But it's a lot of biblical studies, secondarily theological research, especially when he's interacting and pushing back on certain renderings of theological concepts, particularly in Protestantism. Like, he names John MacArthur and John Piper as a couple people that represent some views that he doesn't think are correct, and he names and cites them and responds to them. He also critiques people like N.T. Wright, a little bit more not friendly, that's not the right word, but he's in large overlap agreement with N.T. Wright, but he pushes back on him with some nuances that he would correct. So he's not just firing at one particular camp. He also critiques Catholic thought very, very, very clearly. So he's critiquing a lot of theology around the, all different sides of kind of the Christian spectrum, so to speak. But it's primarily biblical studies in terms of its research. So, okay, the readability of it. I was thinking about how this compares especially to Matthew Bates's other work that I've read, and it leans more on the popular, accessible side. It's less academic in tone than Salvation by Allegiance Alone, for example, or The Birth of the Trinity, or some of those more explicitly academic works. It's not quite as easy or approachable as, I would say, the book Why the Gospel, for example. But it leans more in that direction. It's published by Brazos, which is more of an accessible line of publishing than Baker Academic, for example. So, page for page, it does read quite clearly, quite easily. It's very easy to track and follow. The style is very inviting. Even when he does get into somewhat polemic stuff, it's not harsh, it's not off-putting in tone, I would say. I think it's very, very humble, actually. And it is a little long. It's a little on the long side for a strictly approachable book. And it does go through a lot of topics. So, but page for page, quite readable. I don't need to say much more about that. And then, okay, finally my reaction to this book. I'll try to wrap this up in a couple minutes. I want to comment on things I really appreciate about it. There are multiple things I really appreciate about this. And then I have kind of one overarching quasi-criticism of it, I suppose. And that's what I kind of want to move through. So I appreciate a lot about this book, first of all, and I generally like it, putting it down. It's not my absolute favorite thing that Bates has done. I think Salvation by Allegiance Alone, well, yeah, I think that might still be my favorite. But I quite appreciate it, and I'm sympathetic to a lot of what he's doing here. And so some of the things I appreciate, for example, I really appreciate his discussion of baptism. I found that very challenging as someone who's moved towards a more open to infant baptism in my own understanding of things. His challenge on that front is very, very well taken. I think he marshals some really strong evidence, especially in the lack of evidence in the earliest church practice about the lack of evidence of infant baptism is really something to take seriously. I think his laser focus on the plural versus individualistic application in terms of language in the New Testament was very helpful for me. That really stuck with me. I think his pushback on the bifurcation of justification and sanctification is something that I'd already somewhat agreed with that, but I never had it laid out quite as clearly as he does in this book, and I really liked that. I really liked his pushback on the Ordo Salutis and the way the Protestants formulate that. And the biggest thing I'm in really broad agreement with him on is the really clear definition of what the gospel is, namely those events that testify to Jesus as king. Which that then summons an allegiance, loyalty practicing, full-bodied response to that pronouncement. I love that, and I'm in terms of his biggest of his big ideas, I'm right there with him. And I also agree with him that contending for Christian unity can be really aided by that clear, rock-solid definition of what the gospel is, and then by implication what the gospel is not. So I appreciate all of that stuff. I resonate with all that stuff. I also just enjoyed reading this book. I think that it's really compelling if you're interested in issues of soteriology, if you're interested in ecumenical and church unity work. This is really, really worth spending some time with. My broad, I guess this is a criticism. My kind of, one of my broad takeaways from the book is that I think it might be trying to do too much in terms of moving through too many topics. I kept thinking that if this had been trimmed down, if a few topics had been removed, and then a shorter list of topics developed at more length, I wonder if that might have served the argument a little bit more, and then maybe a follow-up, take some of those topics out, put them in a follow-up book, and do a similar treatment where you give a little bit more treatment at length to a fewer number of topics. I wonder if that would have helped, because as it is, I mean, this is I kind of had the image of someone with a Tommy gun just spraying across the screen, think of a gangster movie or something. That's a little bit of what he's doing here. I mean, it's just a bold, rapid fire argument about touching a ton of ideas that are tripwires for a lot of people, which is part of, I'm going to end by talking a little bit about the controversy around this book, at least in certain sections of the internet. which I find really frustrating. But I do think that might be part of what's going on here, is because he touches, I mean, if someone's really passionate about a certain way of understanding baptism, there's going to be a chapter that upsets them on that. If someone's really passionate about a certain way of understanding justification by faith, there's a chapter on that. If someone's really passionate about the once saved, always saved doctrine, and that's like really important to them, there's a chapter on that. That's going to frustrate them possibly. On and on, right? So there's just so many things, and he is very bold, and it's very rigorous and rooted in like serious study, and like carefully argued. It's thoughtful and carefully argued, and all of that's true. And I appreciate that a lot, but it's just touching so much stuff that I worry a little bit that the kick up of the dust that gets kicked up in the fray might obscure what is really important about this book. And that kind of leads me to the final thoughts I want to add, which is that I do think it's really, I'm not surprised by the controversy, but it's disappointing because I really don't want the noise to drown out the really important stuff that's going on that he's putting his finger on here. And if you don't know about the controversy, you can just look up what the Gospel Coalition is doing in response to this book. I mean, they published a review that is quite bad. I think it's fair to say it's just not a good review in the sense that it does not represent the book well. In fact, it outright mischaracterizes and misrepresents the views of the book. They also released a video for New Testament scholars responding to the book that similarly was just a little baffling in its like misunderstanding of what Bates is doing here. But again, that might be by virtue of just how many things are being addressed. I don't know. But what I want to say about the controversy is just read this book. Don't listen to that noise that's being kicked up, because one of the most important things that all the controversy is missing is the fact that Matthew Bates is in no way, and I want to say this like very clearly and forcefully, he is in no way arguing that he is recovering the gospel in this book. He's no way arguing that. He argues very repetitively and clearly through the whole book that Protestants and Catholics have the true gospel, and they teach the true gospel, and they catechize people in the gospel. It's just that they are also secondary issues that have been loaded into the gospel, that have not been clearly rooted in Scripture and have not even been always clearly defined, and yet they've been bundled into the gospel unnecessarily, and that's unnecessarily contributing to divisions in theology and ecclesiology. And it's really frustrating to me that I think that big point is getting missed here. And I think he's on really, really solid grounds to argue for what he's arguing for here, and it deserves an audience, and it deserves more thoughtful response than just the knee-jerk response to say, oh, well, there's someone claiming to have discovered the gospel, so we can just write him off because that's clearly a quackery. And that's just not what he's arguing, and it's really frustrating that people are going to write him off for that. So I don't want anyone watching this review to get the wrong idea. He is not arguing that the gospel has been lost and is now being recovered through his book. Not at all. His argument is way more thoughtful and way more precise than that. And even if I were his editor, or if I were maybe speaking into the project before it got published, who am I to do that? But just as a thought experiment, I probably would have argued for fewer topics and a little bit more of a constrained argument, with a little bit more surgical focus than just that Tommy gun going across the screen. But be that as it may, it's still just really good stuff. And chapter for chapter, there's just really good argumentation here. He's representing what I would say is probably one of the best biblically rooted articulations of a more Arminianist style theological kind of outworking of soteriology. I don't know that if he would call himself an Arminian, but he really does defend having room in our soteriology for a response, a human response with agency to pledge loyalty in a whole-bodied way, in a whole pistis, loyalty allegiant way to the proclamation of Jesus as King. And even if you're not an Arminian, and if you have like theological quibbling with that kind of room for that human response, you still need to read this book because it's just a really good representation of that view, and it's very like clearly rooted in good exegetical work in Scripture and an informed awareness of, again, those current day soteriological and ecclesiological issues. So I just think it's not my favorite thing he's done, but I think it's really in line with the general quality of everything he's done, and I'm really glad I read it, and it really challenged me in some key ways, and I'm really grateful for the pressure points he's kind of finding and pushing for more clarity and more kind of pastoral and shepherding like precision and care on. So yeah, I'm going to wrap my review here before it gets way too long. I knew this was going to be a long one. This is longer than I typically do for my reviews, but I really wanted to pay some give some time to this one to speak to the controversy, to try to let you, the viewer, know what this book is and is not, and of course my thoughts on it. So I would really encourage people to read this book for themselves if they've been informed by some of the responses to it. I really encourage you to read it for yourself, because I think anyone reading this, Protestant, Catholic, or whatever, will benefit from the things that he's pushing for more thought and reflection on. So those are my thoughts on Beyond the Salvation Wars by Matthew Bates. Great book from Brazos. Thank you for taking a few minutes to watch.